Beneath the streets of New Orleans, there's a network of tunnels that doesn't appear on any official map. The city government knows about them. Construction crews occasionally break through into them during excavation work. Yet, when you ask municipal historians about their origin, you'll get vague answers about old drainage systems or forgotten basements. But here's the problem with that explanation. These tunnels are too sophisticated, too precisely engineered, and they're filled with compressed mud that suggests they were buried deliberately after something catastrophic happened, something that the official record of New Orleans history carefully avoids mentioning. The year was 1849. Most Americans know this date for the California Gold Rush. Few connect it to New Orleans. But while prospectors flooded westward seeking fortune, something was happening in the Mississippi Delta that would reshape the city in ways that still puzzle engineers today. The official story describes routine flooding, standard for a city built on swampland. Reconstruction followed, buildings were restored, and life continued. Except that's not quite what the documentation shows. Because if you dig through the municipal archives, past the sanitized public reports, you'll find construction notes that describe something far stranger than a simple flood. Workers clearing debris in 1850 didn't just remove water damage. They excavated entire city blocks down to depths that made no sense for the buildings that supposedly stood there. Survey teams documented passages beneath the French Quarter that extended far beyond the footprint of any structure in the historical record. And most disturbing of all, they found evidence of infrastructure that predated the founding of New Orleans itself. Brickwork using techniques that weren't supposed to exist in early America. Drainage systems carved into bedrock with precision that baffled even experienced stonemasons of that era. The mud was the first clue that something wasn't adding up. When the Mississippi floods, it leaves behind silt and sediment in predictable patterns. Thin layers near the surface, gradually settling as water recedes. But what workers found in 1850 was different. They encountered compressed mud deposits several feet thick, packed so densely it took specialized tools to remove. This mud filled tunnels, chambers, and passages that extended beneath multiple city blocks. It wasn't gradual accumulation from annual flooding. It was instantaneous burial, as if an enormous volume of mud had swept through the underground infrastructure in a single catastrophic event. Here's where the official timeline starts to fracture. New Orleans was supposedly founded in 1718 by French colonists. The city grew gradually over the next century, expanding from a small settlement into a major port. Standard urban development. Except the tunnels discovered after 1849 don't match that growth pattern. Some passages run beneath areas that were supposedly virgin swampland when the French arrived. Others connect to chambers built with construction methods that weren't documented in Louisiana until decades after they were supposedly built. The alignment is wrong. The scale is wrong. Everything about these deeper layers suggests they belong to a different version of New Orleans history. Take the brickwork. Archival photographs from the 1850s show workers standing beside tunnel walls with joints so tight you couldn't slide a knife blade between the bricks. The surfaces are smooth, almost glazed in places. Modern engineers who've examined these images point out that achieving this level of precision requires either advanced tools or an enormous investment of skilled labor. Neither fits the narrative of early colonial construction. The French settlers of 1718 were focused on survival, building quickly with available materials. They weren't creating underground infrastructure that would make modern subway systems look crude by comparison. Then there's the question of purpose. Why would anyone build such elaborate tunnels beneath a swamp? The official explanation points to drainage, flood control, and storage. But drainage tunnels don't need perfectly vaulted ceilings. Storage chambers don't require brickwork laid with mathematical precision. And flood control systems don't extend in organized grids beneath areas that weren't even part of the city when they were supposedly constructed. Unless these tunnels served a different purpose entirely, unless they were part of something larger that we've been systematically trained not to see. The 1849 event, whatever it actually was, didn't just flood New Orleans. It revealed New Orleans. Or rather, it revealed what lay beneath the city that Americans knew. Workers clearing mud from the streets suddenly found themselves breaking through into spaces that shouldn't exist according to the historical record. Chambers sealed for unknown decades, passages that connected to nothing above ground, and everywhere that compressed mud, packed into every available space as if someone or something had deliberately filled these tunnels to hide them from future discovery. Municipal records from 1850 describe the cleanup effort in careful, sanitized language. They mention removing debris, restoring buildings, and improving drainage. What they don't mention are the decisions made about what to do with the tunnels. Because once the mud was removed and the passages were documented, someone had to decide whether to preserve them, study them, or seal them again. The choice they made tells you everything you need to know about how uncomfortable these discoveries were. Most of the deepest tunnels were filled back in, not with loose rubble, but with the same dense mud that had buried them originally. Construction teams worked through 1850 and 1851, systematically reburying passages that had just been exposed. They blocked entrances. They collapsed certain chambers deliberately. They erased sections from the city maps. And by 1852, the official position was that nothing unusual had been found, just old drainage systems, forgotten basements, and misidentified natural cavities in the bedrock. But photographs don't lie. And the ones that survive from that period show infrastructure that demands explanation beyond the comfortable narratives we've been given. Workers clearing debris through the French Quarter in 1850 documented something that municipal authorities never adequately explained. Chamber after chamber, connected by passages that ran beneath buildings constructed decades after these tunnels supposedly fell out of use. The timeline makes no sense unless you accept that the tunnels existed first and the city was built over them later, inheriting a subterranean framework that predated French colonial presence entirely. One photograph from that period shows a brick archway so perfectly formed that the curvature appears machine-tooled. The workers standing beside it look almost comically small, dwarfed by infrastructure designed for something operating on a completely different scale. This wasn't a drainage culvert. This wasn't a wine cellar. This was part of a system built with ambitions that colonial New Orleans never possessed. Then there's the matter of the connections. Several tunnels extended beyond the city limits as they existed in 1850, running beneath what were then swamplands and undeveloped territories. Why would anyone tunnel through unstable marsh terrain to reach areas with no strategic or commercial value? Unless those areas held value for whoever built the original network. Unless the surface city we know was never the primary concern. But here's where it gets stranger. Some of the sealed chambers contained artifacts that workers couldn't identify. Objects made of materials that shouldn't exist in pre-industrial construction. Metal components showing signs of advanced metallurgy. Stone blocks cut with precision that required tools beyond what colonists possessed. These items were quietly collected, catalogued with vague descriptions, and then disappeared into storage facilities that no longer maintain public records from that era. The official position hardened quickly. By 1852, city documents stopped mentioning unusual discoveries altogether. Tunnel restoration becomes tunnel filling. Exploration becomes suppression. And the photographs that once showed elaborate underground spaces now focus exclusively on surface reconstruction, as if someone realized that documenting what lay beneath was creating more problems than it solved. Jump forward to 1895, when another major flood event struck New Orleans. Once again, mud-filled tunnels were exposed. Once again, workers found passages that didn't match any city planning documents. And once again, the response was systematic reburial. 45 years had passed since the previous discovery, yet the same pattern repeated. Find, document briefly, seal permanently. Why would two generations of city officials make the same decision? Why consistently choose to hide rather than study? The answer becomes obvious when you consider what preservation would require. Opening these tunnels to the public means explaining them. Explaining them means revising the accepted history of New Orleans. Revising that history means acknowledging that American settlement wasn't the beginning of urban development on this land. The construction techniques alone demand answers that conventional history cannot provide. Modern engineers examining the archival photographs point out details that shouldn't be possible with 18th century technology. Perfectly circular tunnel bores suggest mechanical drilling, yet the accepted timeline has no such equipment available. Uniform brick dimensions indicate industrial standardization, yet colonial kilns produced highly variable results. Joint patterns show understanding of stress distribution that civil engineering wouldn't formalize until the 1800s, yet these tunnels supposedly predate that knowledge by decades. Someone knew things they weren't supposed to know. Someone built things they weren't supposed to be able to build. And someone made sure that evidence of this capability stayed buried beneath layers of mud and official silence. The 1927 flood brought the pattern full circle. For the third time in a century, catastrophic water levels exposed sections of the tunnel network. For the third time, workers found infrastructure that challenged the historical narrative. And for the third time, the discoveries were quietly sealed away. By now, the response had become institutionalized. There was no debate, no scientific inquiry, no public disclosure. The protocol was simple. Document minimally, seal completely, discuss never. What makes 1927 different is the photographic evidence that survived. Better cameras, more thorough documentation, and enough images escaping official control to show us exactly what was being hidden. Passages extending in perfectly straight lines for hundreds of meters. Chambers with vaulted ceilings that would have required sophisticated scaffolding and engineering knowledge. Drainage systems showing understanding of hydraulics that supposedly wouldn't reach Louisiana for another 50 years. These weren't primitive colonial structures being gradually discovered. These were sophisticated engineering projects being repeatedly buried. The mud wasn't just filling tunnels. It was concealing proof that New Orleans sits on top of something much older than its official founding date. And that brings us to the question nobody wants to ask. If 3 major flood events in less than a century exposed the same elaborate infrastructure, and if each time the official response was immediate suppression, what does that tell us about the dozens of other cities built on river deltas and coastal plains? What lies beneath Charleston, Savannah, Mobile? What did workers find during their reconstruction projects that never made it into the historical record? The pattern isn't unique to New Orleans. It's just better documented here because the floods kept forcing the truth back to the surface. Other cities may have successfully kept their secrets buried. New Orleans had the misfortune of sitting on land that wouldn't cooperate with the cover-up. By 1930, the tunnel network was permanently sealed. Modern construction buried the access points under layers of concrete and steel. The last generation of workers who saw the passages firsthand took their stories to graves. And the official history settled into its current form, comfortable and unchallenged. Except the photographs remain. The engineering reports exist in scattered archives. The worker testimonies survive in private letters and diaries. And when you assemble these fragments, they tell a story that conventional history desperately wants to ignore. The infrastructure beneath New Orleans tells one story. San Francisco's buried network tells another. But when you start looking at other American cities from the same era, the pattern stops being coincidental and starts becoming systematic. Chicago rebuilt after the Great Fire of 1871. Workers found the same thing. Elaborate tunnel systems beneath the burn zone that predated any documented construction. Boston's subway excavations in the 1890s kept hitting passages that weren't supposed to exist. Philadelphia's water main projects uncovered brick chambers with no apparent connection to colonial infrastructure. Each city has its own official explanation. Each explanation is conveniently vague, and each time the discoveries were quickly reburied and removed from public discussion. What's remarkable isn't that these findings occurred, it's how consistently they were handled. The protocol was identical across different cities, different time periods, different local governments. Document minimally, seal immediately, discuss never. That level of coordination doesn't happen by accident. Seattle provides perhaps the most dramatic example because the 1889 fire created conditions similar to San Francisco's earthquake. Sudden destruction requiring complete reconstruction and deep excavation work across the entire downtown area. The official story is well known. The city was rebuilt one story higher to solve flooding problems, creating the famous Seattle Underground that tourists visit today. But that's only what they let you see. The tour routes show Victorian-era storefronts and sidewalks buried when street levels were raised, brick archways, wooden beams, the remnants of 1880s construction. It's interesting as a historical curiosity, but nothing controversial. What they don't show you are the discoveries made during the original excavation work, the passages that went far deeper than Victorian basements, the stonework that predated Seattle's founding, the infrastructure that, according to every available record, shouldn't exist at all. Workers in 1889 described finding chambers 20 feet below the supposed street level, built with precision that didn't match anything in Seattle's documented history. Some sections showed evidence of advanced drainage systems. Others contained support structures built for loads that made no sense for a frontier town established just 40 years earlier. And like San Francisco, like New Orleans, like every other city where this pattern emerged, these findings were quietly sealed away and erased from the official record. The photographic evidence from Seattle's reconstruction shows the same architectural language visible in San Francisco's 1906 documentation. Perfectly circular access shafts, uniform brickwork with impossibly tight joints, passages extending in geometrically precise lines. It's as if whoever built beneath these cities was working from the same blueprint, using the same techniques, following the same engineering principles. But here's where it gets stranger. The cities aren't just connected by similar underground infrastructure. They're connected by timing. San Francisco, 1906. Seattle, 1889. Chicago, 1871. Boston, 1872. Every major American city experienced a catastrophic fire or natural disaster in the late 1800s or early 1900s. Every disaster required extensive excavation and reconstruction, and every excavation uncovered infrastructure that contradicted the accepted historical timeline. You could dismiss one city as an anomaly, two cities as coincidence. But when the pattern repeats across dozens of locations, or within a 50-year window, all producing the same unexplainable findings, all handled with the same institutional suppression, you're looking at something systematic. The conventional explanation would be that these were simply old utility tunnels or mining operations that were poorly documented. But that doesn't explain the precision of the construction. It doesn't explain why passages appear beneath areas that were supposedly uninhabited wilderness before American settlement. It doesn't explain the uniform architectural style across thousands of miles of supposedly independent construction projects. And it certainly doesn't explain why every city that found this infrastructure immediately sealed it away instead of studying it. Modern ground-penetrating radar has made it possible to map underground structures without excavation. Cities have used this technology extensively for utility planning and construction projects. But there's a curious pattern in how the data is presented. Maps show modern infrastructure, water mains, electrical conduits, subway tunnels, sewer systems. Everything built in the last century appears clearly labelled and documented. But deeper structures, the ones that show up on the scans but don't match any known construction project. Those are marked as anomalies or left unlabeled entirely. Not unknown, not unexplained, just absent from the official interpretation of the data. Several engineers who've worked with this radar data have quietly noted that the anomalies form patterns. They're not random geological features or natural cavities. They're organized, systematic, interconnected. In some cities, they create grids that mirror the street layouts above them. In others, they form networks that extend for miles beneath areas that were supposedly virgin territory before modern development. But publishing these observations means questioning the accepted timeline. It means suggesting that sophisticated infrastructure existed before the cities that supposedly built it. And in academic and professional circles, that kind of suggestion ends careers. So the data sits in archives, marked as inconclusive, while the official history remains unchallenged. What makes this particularly disturbing is the realization that we're not dealing with ancient history. This isn't speculation about civilizations that existed thousands of years ago. These are findings from the 1800s and early 1900s, documented with photography, described in written records, witnessed by thousands of workers. This is recent history being actively suppressed, not ancient mysteries being debated. The workers who saw these tunnels weren't archaeologists looking for lost civilizations. They were construction crews trying to rebuild their cities after disasters. They had no agenda, no theory to prove. They simply reported what they found. And what they found, consistently, across multiple cities, was infrastructure that shouldn't exist according to the timeline we've been taught. The implications extend beyond individual cities. If you map the locations where these discoveries occurred, a pattern emerges that's impossible to ignore. They cluster along coastlines, major river systems, and natural harbours, places where trade routes would intersect, places where a maritime civilization would establish strategic outposts. This isn't random distribution. It's deliberate placement according to geographic logic that predates modern urban planning by decades, possibly centuries. Consider what this means for our understanding of North American settlement. The official narrative presents a continent that was largely wilderness before European colonization, with only scattered indigenous populations and no significant urban infrastructure. But the underground evidence tells a different story. It suggests organized city planning, advanced engineering, and construction capabilities that match or exceed what the settlers supposedly brought with them. The timing of the discoveries creates another uncomfortable question. Why did so many American cities experience catastrophic fires and disasters within such a narrow time frame? Chicago burned in 1871, Boston burned in 1872, Seattle burned in 1889, San Francisco shook and burned in 1906. The official explanations vary: faulty construction, wooden buildings, accident, earthquake. But the result was always the same: massive excavation projects that exposed infrastructure the cities weren't supposed to have. You could argue these were simply coincidental disasters in an era of rapid urban growth. Fires were common. Earthquakes happen. But the pattern of response is what stands out. Every city immediately launched reconstruction projects that required deep excavation. Every city uncovered unexplainable infrastructure. Every city then sealed those discoveries and continued building as if nothing unusual had been found. That's not coincidence. That's coordination. Modern construction in these cities follows a curious protocol. Whenever deep excavation is required for foundations, subway systems, or utility upgrades, the projects are managed with unusual secrecy. Work zones are sealed off more thoroughly than necessary for simple construction. Photography is restricted. Workers often sign non-disclosure agreements that seem excessive for routine infrastructure projects. Engineers who've worked on these projects occasionally make vague references to unexpected complications or geological anomalies that required changes to the planned excavation depth, but specific details never make it into public reports. The final documentation shows only what was built, never what was found in the process of building it. This pattern extends internationally. London's underground expansion projects have encountered sealed chambers that don't appear on any historical map. Paris metro construction crews have documented passages beneath the catacombs that predate Roman occupation. Istanbul's subway development uncovered Byzantine infrastructure built over much older foundations that shouldn't exist according to the accepted timeline. Each discovery follows the same trajectory: initial documentation, academic speculation, then administrative silence. The findings get reclassified as misidentified medieval construction or incorrectly dated Roman engineering. Anything to avoid the obvious conclusion that these structures represent something older and more sophisticated than the civilizations we credit with building them. What makes this particularly frustrating is that the evidence isn't hidden in restricted archives or classified documents. It exists in municipal records, construction reports, and engineering surveys that are technically public. But it's scattered across hundreds of sources, buried in technical language, and never synthesized into a coherent narrative that would force uncomfortable questions. You have to actively search for it. You have to know what you're looking for. And even then, you're assembling fragments of a picture that was deliberately broken apart to prevent anyone from seeing the whole image. The radar data presents the most compelling modern evidence. Ground-penetrating technology can map underground structures with remarkable precision. Cities use it constantly for utility planning and construction safety. The scans show everything: water mains, electrical conduits, subway tunnels, natural cavities, and those mysterious deeper structures that don't fit any category. Those anomalies appear with consistent characteristics across different cities. They're too regular to be natural formations. They're too sophisticated to be primitive construction. They form networks that suggest purpose and planning, but they're always deeper than the infrastructure we acknowledge building, always more extensive than the cities above them should require, and always dismissed as inconclusive data when anyone questions their origin. Several geological surveys have noted that these deeper structures show signs of significant age, not decades, but potentially centuries or more. Mineral deposits, erosion patterns, and sedimentation suggest they've been underground far longer than the cities above them have existed. But publishing those observations means challenging the entire accepted timeline of urban development in North America. It means suggesting that sophisticated construction capabilities existed before the civilizations we credit with creating them. So the data sits in archives, marked as requiring further study, while development continues above structures we refuse to acknowledge exist below. The question isn't whether this infrastructure exists. The evidence for that is overwhelming and documented across multiple independent sources. The question is why there's such systematic resistance to investigating it properly, why every discovery gets immediately sealed, reclassified, or explained away rather than studied as the historical anomaly it clearly represents. The answer might be simpler than elaborate conspiracy theories suggest. Acknowledging these structures means rewriting established history. It means admitting that our understanding of civilization's development is incomplete at best, fundamentally wrong at worst. It means questioning the credentials and conclusions of generations of historians and archaeologists who built their careers on the timeline we're now being forced to doubt. That's not a comfortable position for academic institutions or government agencies. It's easier to dismiss the evidence, seal the tunnels, and maintain the narrative than to confront the possibility that we've been systematically wrong about our own recent past. But the infrastructure remains, beneath our cities, deeper than we're supposed to look, more extensive than we're willing to acknowledge, waiting in darkness, preserved by the same institutional silence that keeps most people from ever learning it exists at all. The tunnel networks beneath these cities aren't going anywhere. They're still there, mapped by radar systems that city planners quietly ignore, occasionally exposed during deep construction projects that get sealed again before anyone asks too many questions. Every few decades, another flood or earthquake forces these passages back to the surface, and each time, the response is identical. Document briefly, seal permanently, forget officially. What's remarkable isn't that this infrastructure exists, it's that we've managed to keep it from becoming common knowledge for over a century. Thousands of workers saw these tunnels, hundreds of engineers documented them, dozens of municipal archives preserve the evidence, yet somehow the average person has never heard about any of it. That level of sustained institutional silence doesn't happen by accident. It requires coordination, consistency, and commitment to maintaining a narrative, even when the physical evidence keeps contradicting it. The question isn't whether something older and more sophisticated than colonial America built beneath our cities. The photographs, the engineering reports, the worker testimonies all confirm that it did. The question is why we're still pretending it didn't, and what else we've been systematically trained not to see.